This series is brought to you by Globe Plants. What's going on, team? We are back with part 4, and today we are talking about landscaping and the environment. Of course, with Globe Plants being the official sponsor of this series, we are going to be using a lot of Globe Plants from our pre-downloaded Globe Plants library. Now, we'll talk about all of these amazing things as we work through. However, I want to get started with the actual environment and potentially setting up our first render scene. So when we set up our environment, I like to set up my first scene. Let's come down to the bottom, let's go to media and click the first plus button. This is just a generic step to set everything up and work our way through. What I really want to do is make sure all these settings are right before going on and making my next image. So let's get started by jumping all the way across the image, changing it from full HD across to 8K. If your computer supports higher resolution, bump it up as high as you possibly can. Now we can do tiled rendering and we can also do a view set, but for the purpose of this, I'm just going to simply leave it off. Next, we're going to jump to our camera and we're going to set up our very first scene. For me personally, I almost want it to look like we're standing at the bottom of the ocean. We're standing at the hill, looking up at this fantastic house, and we want to be standing maybe somewhere over here from an angle, somewhere different, you know, have a few different angles set up. So potentially this might be one shot, another one might be over here. So I'm going to come back all the way to the front of the house and I'm going to slide my focal length back and forward until I'm relatively happy. For me, I think anywhere from a 35mm would look quite nice for the depth of this image. At the same time, that means I need to push quite far back in this scene to make sure this whole house still fits. If I wanted to continue, maybe make it 100mm, that means I'd once again have to fly out quite far back to be able to fit everything in this scene. Now, 100mm in this scenario isn't exactly great, so we're going to dive back to 35mm, press OK, fly until we're happy with that scene. So I'm going to put my scene somewhere just about here, and then I'm going to hover over my image 1 and refresh. By refreshing, that is going to lock in our position, and when we move around, if we double click back on image 1, it'll go back to that image very rapidly. While we're on camera, we can dive into a couple additional features. So first of all, we have depth of field. Because this is a relatively far distant shot, we don't really need to worry about depth of field because we're not in close proximity to something. However, if we wanted to pick a focal point, we could click focal point and dive to that space. So everything in the foreground would be nice and blurred out and we're focusing on the house itself. Otherwise, you can click all the way at the back to the furthest point, so it is selecting that. If we wanted to change the aperture as well to let in more or less light, we could, and we could also change the bokeh shape. So if you look down the bottom, you'll see that the blur slightly changes. Next, we can dive into camera effect and we have our standard vignetting. Vignetting is basically the camera focusing in on itself and more black or white coming in around the edges. So the higher it goes up, the more it kind of focuses the eye to the center by fading away the distance. I don't personally like it too much. We don't need it in this case. If you wanted just a little bit to really focus your eye to the center of this project, you could, but because we're trying to focus the eye all the way as far as we possibly can, I don't really need it. Para-realism is something I have to say slowly because it's very hard to say time and time again in quick succession. But basically what it does is it emphasizes the vertical lines of the camera angle. So if you're doing a skyscraper or something like that, this is when this becomes important. Near clipping in this instance is not applicable because we're so far back. So we'll skip over that one. Composition, layouts, we have our grid. And if we wanted to use the rule of thirds, this is how you get your grid lines set up. So in this instance, we could come up a little bit, put the house in the middle of the composition, and then refresh our scene so we're permanently saved there. If you want to change the grid lines to a different grid, you can, but composition, rule of thirds is the best way to go. Now we've gone through environment, we've gone through camera. We can go through render as well, and global illumination is something that we can play with, turn it on and off. Basically, it allows the sun reflections throughout the project. If you're having a lot of glitches come out in your video exports, Simply turn that off and it will get rid of that glitch. Usually it means your computer isn't powerful enough to be able to do anything with global illumination. If we adjust these sliders ever so slightly, we can see how our shadows play effect on the building itself. So adjusting them more or less either provides more of a shadow or less of a shadow. For me, I'm happy to leave it where it was, 150 and 0.4, because we're not playing with too many shadows in this instance. The 400 meter shadow is something I will like to play with because it is either no shadows at all and it plays a very harsh shadow, or it feathers it a little bit more. I like to have my shadows quite nicely feathered because as we start adding trees, you'll see that context change. The shadow bias as well is going to play into effect on all of the contours. So if you don't want as many shadows on the contours, you increase the shadow bias. If you want a little bit more, you decrease that bias. And last but not least is the reflection on the glass. Turn it on and off however you wish, but usually reflections are a great thing to turn on. Now we could also dive into the effects panel, but I personally think the more you play with this, the less you're going to have a quality render that's consistent time and time again. So we're going to leave effects completely off, but same principles, you can go through, slide and adjust as you see fit. The clay render is something that's fun to play with as well. So if we were changing that to a white clay render, we could untick our glass so that the actual glass comes into play. And then we could keep unticking things as we see fit. But again, clay render, not something we're going to be talking about in this beginner's tutorial. Now, like I promised, we are going to dive deep into this environment to make sure our scene is perfectly set up before we start placing these beautiful trees and landscaping into the actual scene. So let's scroll down to the bottom and start with our ocean. First of all, I want to enable the ocean. It's going to be way too high in the project. That's okay. We're simply going to slide that slider down ever so slightly and try get that scene to align where we want it to be. Unfortunately, the way I've designed it, the contours aren't working too well with the natural ocean. So we're not going to use the natural ocean. Instead, I'm going to fake it in this image. So let's turn the ocean off. Let's come back into our library. Let's go into objects. We're going to go to water and we're simply going to select a water cube. Now I'm going to drop this water cube roughly here, fly around, rotate it as I need it to be, increase the size significantly by simply dragging the sliders across, coming back to my scene and adjusting further until it's perfectly aligned with where I want it to be. Now the good thing is when I select this ocean, I can change it from pool 1, pool 2 and pool 3. So I think pool 2 looks quite nice in this scenario. Next, we want to play with our HDRI sky. Now, I'm aware that we introduced one HDRI sky before, but what we actually want to do is adjust and fine tune to make this look incredible. So let's break it down. First of all, we want to rotate until we find the perfect and optimal shadows for this project. I have it set straight on 0, but if we let it rotate around, we can see the shadows being cast over the entire house, as well as the intensity at 4. So what I want to do is probably leave it at 0 because it works in this instance, but I want to play with the intensity ever so slightly. The more I lower the intensity, the darker the scene gets. So at 1.5, I quite like that. It's nice and dark and moody. Now what we're going to do is scroll back up to the top, go to our details and untick auto exposure. Immediately it's going to go dark. Because obviously the auto exposure is gone, we want to manually adjust our exposure. So simply sliding this exposure slider up ever so slightly until we're perfectly happy with the environment. So at about 3.83, I'm okay with this exposure. At the same time, we have our details panel below that's opened up that lets us go through individual elements. First of all, our ambient is going to indicate all of the glare that we have from our project. So sliding these sliders down, you'll see the ambient brightness increase and decrease on the model. Because we're looking at the glass predominantly in this scene, I don't mind having the ambience a little bit higher, maybe about 1.3. The white balance is, of course, talking about the sun and the color the sun gives off. So slide it all the way up, a lot more yellow, slide it down, it's a lot more blue. In this environment, I want it to be a little bit warmer. We are at the beach, so 6,800, 7,000 is about right. The sun reflection and the size, as well as the intensity, is something we can play with. So if we slide the sun scales up you'll see that the actual sun is brighter or darker. Very simple stuff, nothing too crazy. Just basically go through these until you're happy with the environment of how it looks. So by turning the sun reflection down, I'm not bouncing my sunlight off as much, which gives us those nice, dark, rich contours and contrast in this model. But yet by having the sun bright, it still gives us enough richness and color overall. Now that we've adjusted all of those scenes, we can go back into our HDRI sky and play with our intensity one last time. So we just adjust the intensity of the sky to match our environment that we've set up in the camera angles. Now what you'll notice is at the very top of this building, the shadows are being cast, but at the same time, the sun's kind of coming through. So we want to come back across to our path tracing and our rendering section in the middle here of the camera. And we want to adjust our shadows and our shadow bias. So by lowering our shadow bias and adjusting our shadows to a little bit lower, we now have our shadows being portrayed exactly as they would be in real life. Now at the same time, it started bucketing outside here, so I apologize if you can hear some rain in the background. We've got some crazy weather here in Australia at the moment. Nothing like this render is at all. So we have this beautiful picturesque scene, we've set it up, we've got the global luminization on, we've set up our environment, we know what it's going to look like. We can always come back to this image without having to redo any of these settings. And if we wanted to do a second image, well, we simply fly across, find the camera position we want, and then hit the plus button again. So in this scenario, maybe we wanted something over here, overlooking from the side, hit the plus button, and make sure that our water is extended far enough. And there we go. Now we have two camera angles, two renders set up very quickly, very rapidly, reusing those angles. What I will point out, if you fly around to the backside, you will have to adjust most of these settings to fine tune it again. I always like to set up one render and one scene. So by sticking to image one, we can work through our landscaping design slowly, but with precision and detail. First, let's get started with some basic stuff. We want to populate the environment. So if we come down to the bottom and hit populate, then we go to foliage and we go paint. I want to come across to my grass and flowers and select one of my grass to start painting this actual building. So for me, I don't mind most of these grasses. They're all quite okay. Globe Plants has some great ones as well. I haven't purchased any of them, so that's why I'm not using Globe Plants grass. For this instance, I'm simply going to select long grass 2, drag, drop, let that come in. Now I'm going to click on long grass 2 and increase my density to 100%, meaning when I paint, everywhere I paint, grass is going to come up. I'm then going to click on my paintbrush tool and decrease my size 2 meters so I can get a decent bit of control. Now, if you've ever asked yourself, what is the difference between a high quality render and an average render you see all over Instagram? Well, the difference is the quality, the care, and the assets. That's why I've teamed up with Globe Plants to be able to give you an incredible library of the world's best 3D photorealistic vegetation, trees, shrubs, and everything in between. I've used Globe Plants for a very long time now. You've seen them in my videos before, and finally we've come together to be able to actually bring you a series worthwhile. So if you're looking for some incredible 3D plants, regardless of where you are situated around the world, it doesn't matter if you're in America, Australia, Africa, Europe, they've got all of the plants available for every single person around the globe. So make sure you check out Globe Plants in the description down below. The link is there for your convenience. If I zoom in and fly into this section, you'll see that I can start painting effortlessly and it will paint the grass quite well. Now, obviously I've got my depth of field on, hence why everything's so blurry when I'm here. So let's quit media mode and you'll see not blurry anymore. If you accidentally paint a wall or something you don't like, you can select the eraser tool and just unpaint that section there. So it's simple as that. Come back to your paintbrush, lower it to 1 so you can get a lot more control next to the building. And then what you want to do is basically go through the rest of this project, add grass to its entirety, and I won't bore you with that, so I'll skip ahead and you'll see all of this grass beautifully painted in. Before I jump ahead, of course, there is a quicker way to do this, but the results aren't as pristine and they aren't as nice. So if we come back to populate and we go scatter, we can drop our long grass in, select long grass, go 100, and click our scatter tool and then click on the grass. It will automatically scatter green grass everywhere across that material. I can obviously click multiple times to keep it scattered and keep it going. So that's a multiple press, but even if I zoom in here, you'll see the difference is actually quite visible and not as neat. So I like to paint my grass in personally. I like to take the time. It's a little bit soothing, a little bit relaxing. If you simply just click on that grass, you can immediately go back to that paintbrush and continue painting in that environment. And there we go. Now I've painted in all of my grass and you can see it come up with this orange because I've got my distance marker set. If I double click on image 1, it will all disappear, and that's for a good reason. If I come up to edit, preferences, and then come to grass fading, you'll see I have it medium. If I want to see more of the grass, I can select far and press OK, and some of that grass will come into play again. Now the reason I don't is obviously it uses more computing power to display more of the vegetation. So back to edit, back to medium for me, and I'm happy simply remembering that my grass is there. Now we want to go in and start adding some of our beautiful trees and our accessories. So let's go back to library, and if you don't have any of the globe plants features, first of all, you can grab it from the description below. There's some amazing selections of trees from all around the world. So feel free to grab a bundle and install it directly into user library. If you've never downloaded a Globe Plants bundle before, or even an individual plant package, it's very simple to install. Simply download it, go to your documents folder in your computer, find Twinmotion 2023.1 or whichever Twinmotion version you're using, double click on it, double click on user library and copy and paste the file you've downloaded from Globe Plants directly into your user library. That's it. If you've got Twinmotion open, close it, refresh it, start it again, and you'll see the user library appear. However, all you have to do is seriously just copy and paste that into your user library, and then inside Twinmotion, you can go there, click on Globe Plants, and have your folder structure exactly as you set it up. It's not very hard at all, and it's definitely the easiest way to import some amazing vegetation. Now what I want to do is use some low poly trees in the background. Up the top of this building behind the actual environment, I want to create some sort of forest, some sort of bushland. So I'm going to go through and individually click into a number of different trees. So to do that, I'm simply going to select a few of my Globe Plants trees, drop them in, and then just individually scatter them around exactly where I want them to be. So because they come in as groups, you can select each individual magnolia, drag it across, select a different one, drag it where you need it to be, and continue that method. If you wanted to create individual trees instead of having them in bundles, you can easily right click on that magnolia tree and go add to user library, and you'll just have that individual magnolia tree available to you. That way, if you wanted to go through and paint a series of trees, you could quite easily do that without having to manually position them and manually move them. What I find about manually positioning the trees is you get a lot more control and a much nicer, much more detailed environment. Once you've added plenty of trees in the background to start creating your actual forest, we can go back to populate, we can go back to paint, and we can use some of the bushes available. Now again, you can either use the Globe Plants library using some of the low poly because they're in the background and we don't want to overkill our project. We only want to use the high poly in the specific areas. Or we could also go to our vegetation, go to our bushes and drag and drop a base bush because it is in the background. Let's select all of our Globe Plants on the right hand side, turn them off quickly so we can do this a little bit easier. What I've done is made my life hard. So I'm going to erase all of these extra base bushes that I've made. Going to get my paintbrush, simply paint across the entire bottom length of this forest and increase the density of that. So now we have a ton of base bushes. Turning back on our trees, going back down below to our image 1, we can see those beautiful trees have come into play and then we can focus on our foreground. So coming back into library, let's go into objects, let's go into vegetation, and let's go rocks. I want to drop a couple rocks into this environment, just basically as fillers into the land, something a little bit different. So it's not just grass and sand. This way, the rocks actually add a little bit of texture and something that we can utilize in our landscape design. Now next, we're going to go back into our user library. We're going to go into globe plants, and we're going to go into high poly. And you're going to see the quality difference between these low poly trees in the background and the high poly globe plants. So let's go into one of these and find something stunning. There's some beautiful shrubs and bushes available, but what I'm looking for is a grass tree. So I've got a number of grass trees available to me from globe plants, and they're incredibly detailed. So if I zoom into this grass tree, you'll see the exquisite detail all the way to the finer flowers growing at the very top, and even the bark itself. These grass trees are absolutely stunning, and by far an extremely Australian tree that you'll basically only find here in Australia. Don't quote me on that, I'm not a landscape expert, but I do know they grow very well here. So what I'll do is scatter a few of these beautiful grass trees around, and then continue to add some high poly plants. Now I've included this tree right here, which I only really want the largest one. So what I'm going to do is select one of the trees, drag it all the way across at the back of my building, introduce it into the environment. Then I can select the remaining trees and simply delete them because I don't need them for now. I do want to define the delineation and the difference between the house, the beach, and the land. So what I'm going to do is simply grab some more globe plants trees and basically articulate this clear delineation line. Now I've gone ahead and added quite a bit of high poly globe plants to this project, and I must warn you, if you do have a slow computer or you just don't have one that can perform overly well, you may need to come back into your preferences, go to your quality, and reduce your quality to be able to speed your computer back up, because you're adding thousands and thousands of little polygons into your project and it just won't be able to perform. So even with an M1 Ultra chipset, with all of these tiny high quality polygon lines, there's just too much going on. However, there is an exceptional view right here that could be created by this incredible cantilever with these globe plants images. So if I simply go back into image 2, fly back into that perfect angle of that stunning cantilever of the master bedroom overlooking the ocean, roughly line up my line where I want it to be, create a new image, go to my camera, pick my new focal point being the master bedroom furthest point, exit that out and refresh my scene. We'll see all these stunning globe plants bokeh whilst the distance is nice and crisp. We can see a little bit of water coming there in the background, and we don't have any environment. So we'd have to go through and add a few more trees to the background of this environment to really give this render right here some absolute life and flavor. So I'll quit media mode, copy and paste a few of these trees over here, and there we go. I've introduced a few more trees into the environment. Personally, I actually don't think we need any bokeh, any depth of field in this, so I'm going to turn the depth of field off and refresh my scene. So now we have the detail of all of these beautiful globe plants right here at the front. And because I haven't showcased them enough, I just want to fly in with a little bit more texture, a little bit more depth, so you can see the detail in these high poly images. Now, I've added some bushes, I've added some shrubs to delineate, some flowers, some wildflowers, and everything is looking absolutely stunning, obviously in a spring collection, because that is when trees look the best. Like, look at the detail and quality of this plant in front of me. Again, I'm not a landscaper. I don't know an exceptional amount about the specific plants and the details, but I do know that these are the highest quality 3D plants money can buy on the internet right now. Now, if we quit our media mode once more and fly back into our environment, we need to be able to get in and out of this house. There's a number of ways we can do that, and I actually want to create my own stepping stones. So let's go back to library, let's go objects, and let's go primitive. I actually want to use a 1x1 meter box, drag and drop that into our environment. Then I want to adjust it ever so slightly and tap my way through until I get little concrete pavers of approximately the right size that I'm happy with. So for me, that's a half decent concrete paver. I can place it where I need to be and simply rotate it until I'm happy. If I wanted to increase the height so it's higher and sits away from the grass, I can go back into my library, go into my materials, pick my concrete, and drag my concrete base onto those steps. Next, what I'd have to do is duplicate a number of these steps all the way to the actual front door. Now, by holding shift and duplicating, I can just change that number. Let's go 5, and it will automatically make me 5 steps quickly going forward. And I can make maybe 1 or 2 more here so that now I can begin turning up this hill. And if I wanted to, I could do it in a very linear pattern, or I can simply let the contours of the land define the pattern of these stepping stones. I don't mind allowing the contours to define the pattern of the stepping stone. I'm actually quite okay with it. So I'm simply going to continue one by one, creating this meandering path to the actual home. And now that I've reached approximately this front sliding door, I believe there's a sliding door here and a sliding door over here as well. I can either fine tune some of these steps so they're closer together and are more appropriate to the landscape. And when I'm comfortable, I can go in and create one large giant step or potentially multiple stepping stones up to that house. And then I can again adjust some of these meandering stones somewhere a little bit more so they naturally come to the front of my landscaping steps. And by creating these meandering steps, I've provided a single space to move one of these grass trees exactly in the middle and allow us to walk around the stunning native vegetation. Coming back to image 1, we can see we've slowly created that meandering path. We can go into our library, we can come into our characters, and potentially we can even add some posed people. So let's go summer because we're obviously on a beach. Let's pick a couple people walking past. So let's grab this Ethan bloke, drop him into our scene, and let's add another person next to him, potentially somebody walking as well. So let's keep scrolling. This one here will do. Let's download her into the scene, add her into our environment as well. And then last but not least, let's go back to our sketch fab. Let's go cars and vehicles. Let's fly across to the top back of the road. Oop, maybe a little bit too fast, a little bit too far. And let's drop one of these stunning Porsches into our scene. And there we go. Now we have the start of our first render. If I was to export this out as it is, it would look phenomenal. You'd see all of the grass and all of the textures coming into play. You'd see the sand, you'd see the rippling water, and of course, the stunning background as well. Now obviously I have my clipping field turned on, so until I get significantly closer, you cannot see any of that grass and any of that detail, which when you come a lot closer, or you go to something like image 3 and change our preferences of grass fading from medium to far, we'll see all of that coming into play. Absolutely stunning. Anyway, that's all for episode 4 for the environment and landscaping. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you check out Globe Plants in the description down below. Grab some of these incredible high quality 3D plants, trees and shrubs. Make sure that your renders are elevated to the next level. If you have any comments, questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below. But like always, I'll see you next Monday.